Jimbo Paris, and you are listening to The Jimbo Paris Show. All right, what's up, guys? This is Jimbo Paris here. Welcome to The Jimbo Paris Show. And today we have Dr. Ed Daube, and he's basically an emotions doctor, a clinical psychologist, and an Amazon best-selling author. And he's dedicated his life to just transforming people's lives. Let's hear what he has to say.
Hi, Jimbo. Thank you for having me today.
Pleasure is all mine. So can you begin by telling me who you are, what you're about, and what your message is?
Yeah, I'm Ed Daube, PhD. I'm a clinical psychologist. I spent 32 years working for the California Youth Authority in a correctional institution here in California. And when I got out of graduate school, this was my first and only job. When I got out of graduate school, I was working in a setting, working with young women, all of whom had been abused emotionally, physically, sexually. And I was training staff who were very jaded about dealing with emotions. And the language that I had when I got out of graduate school was here. And the language of both the young ladies I was working with and the staff were here. I had no way to communicate, yet I needed to work with them clinically and I needed to train them. So I had to develop a way to do that. And I developed the idea of emotions as tools. I had to explain to these young women who did not know how to deal with feelings of anger. They were suicidal. And the staff also didn't know how to talk to the young women. So I gave them the notion of tools. Now, when you think of tools, you think of your cell phone. You think of the remote for your TV. You can think of a sewing machine or a saw. And for the staff, it was their handcuffs. It was their batons, whatever it happened to be. So now I could talk to them about emotions in the context of you need to understand what emotions are, why we have them, and how to strategically deploy them to work for you. So I did that for 32 years. When I finally retired about 15 years ago, I took a look at what was going on out in the real world. And folks don't understand what emotions are because we don't get taught that. They're not taught in school. You don't learn it anywhere. So what tends to happen is people tend to see their emotions as messy. They want to get rid of their emotions because they think their emotions control them. They don't. So I wrote 2 books. I wrote my first book, Emotions as Tools, which basically describes the whole model. And then I thought about what's going on with this whole thing with anger. You see stories in the news about people blaming their anger for beating their girlfriends or beating their wives or doing dumb things. And then I wrote my second book, which was all about anger. So I wrote the 2 books. And again, my goal was to educate people because there was a gap, there was a lack in terms of helping people understand what emotions were and why we have them and how they work. And then I started a blog, which is theemotionsdoctor.com. And I have over 200 posts on that blog. It's a free blog, and I cover all kinds of topics, all emotions, what the emotion cycle are, anger, anxiety, guilt, shame, all of that. And I have an index to all of my posts, which is on the homepage. So you can access all of my posts now by title and by the post itself. And it's a one-click access to each post. So now in retirement, I do podcasts and I still write to my blog. And again, the idea is to educate people because folks don't understand why they have emotions or how they work. And that is what I do in retirement now.
Excellent. And where did this passion come from?
Well, the passion came from the idea that I was trained as a psychologist. And as a psychologist, my whole focus is to help people learn about themselves, to help people grow. And the idea was, how can I apply these skills in the best way and the most effective way to help people in areas where they need to grow. And that was emotions. Now, the interesting thing here is that I call myself the emotions doctor right now. But when I was in graduate school, I was basically the emotions avoider. It was when I was in graduate school in here in California. I had one of my neighbors of my family where I grew up was working in a place called Henry Olaf House in San Francisco. So I went up to him and I said, "Can I sit in on the groups?" These were for people who were alcoholics, they were drug addicts. I had no problem with either alcohol or with drugs. And he told me no. I said, "Well, why not?" He said, "Well, I'll tell you what you can do. You can be a participant observer in those groups." And I thought, well, that's a piece of cake. Here I am. I'm PhD. I'm in graduate school. I won't have any problem at all. Well, Jimbo, it took them 6 months. It took them 6 months, and they called me a non-drinking alcoholic. And the reason they called me that was because for me, I avoided my emotions by going into my academics. They avoided their emotions by going into drinking, using drugs. I was basically the same as they, except I did it differently. And that basically was what opened my eyes to the whole issue of emotions. And then, of course, I started my first job and I was right in the thick of emotions. And I kind of made it my life work to help people understand what emotions are and why they have them. And that's kind of where the passion came from. Because for me, I avoided all of my emotions growing up. I had them, but I avoided them because they were messy. And they are until you understand them.
How did you understand them?
I began to take a look at what emotions are, and I saw them as tools. And this is how it works, by the way. Let me explain. If you take a look, I have young grandkids. I have one who's like 1, and I have one that's 3. And they're born, we all are, we're born with emotions. And we are hardwired to constantly scan our surroundings for threat. We've done this since we lived in caves. So what happens is you're constantly scanning your environment, and when you perceive a threat, your amygdala automatically sends you into what's called fight or flight. And you are set to unconsciously react to whatever the threat is that you perceive. It happens very fast. And that, by the way, is what leads us to believe that our emotions control us. They don't. So what happens is you react emotionally, and then because now we have evolved and we have the cortex, the thinking part of our brain, we now have the ability to assess the nature of the threat. So the way the emotion cycle should work is you unconsciously perceive the threat, you react, you then take a step back, which is to create physical safety, and you take a deep breath, which creates psychological distance, and now you can assess the nature of the threat and choose how you want to respond. That is the essence of emotional mastery, and that's what I write about. I teach people how to master their emotions as tools, and here's why. If you understand, let's take anger, for example. The message of anger is that there is a threat that I perceive, that I believe I am more powerful than the threat, and I can eliminate it by throwing enough force at it. Anger prepares you for war. So if you understand this now, what you can do is you can say, okay, if there is indeed a real threat, then I am going to go to battle and I'm going to eliminate the threat. But if there's no threat, I'm going to take a step back and I'm going to say, wait a minute, no threat, no need for anger. So I'm going to choose a different way to respond to it. Now, for men, we're basically taught that we shouldn't experience a whole lot of emotions. If we, as a young man, if we show sadness, we get put down for it. If we show anger, we say, hey, that's manly, that's powerful. So what we tend to do is we tend to default to anger because we don't want to feel guilty. We don't want to feel shame. We don't want to feel sadness. Those are called so-called negative emotions. They're not, that's what they're called because they feel bad. So instead of feeling bad, we default to anger. And when we do that, we use anger as a secondary emotion. Now, the myth is that anger is always a secondary emotion, and it's not. Because sometimes even we as men have a right to be angry. And that anger is genuine and it's real, and we need to act on it. But we need to learn the difference between when anger is genuine and valid and when we're using it to cover over other emotions. Now, for women, when women show anger, they tend to get put down for it. Men don't like to deal with angry women. Years and years ago, I went on to a LinkedIn website, and I went to it was a forum. And I said, look, I'm a man. I want to know what happens when you as a woman express anger. 2,000 responses basically later, they said, as a woman, I can't express anger because I get called names, I get marginalized, I get demeaned, can't do it. So what women tend to do is they tend to default to something like sadness instead of expressing their anger. And what I'm saying to both men and women, understand that your anger is often genuine and you need to learn to express it. Now, sometimes men can express their anger directly. Women may have to do it indirectly. Women may have to do it in a more passive sense. When that happens, they keep their anger, they just don't express it. Because what's happening here in our society, Jimbo, is there are different display rules. The anger is the same, but men are allowed to display it, women are not. Women can display sadness, men can't. And the challenge is that if we can't express it, we tend to look at it as an invalid emotion. It's not. So men need to learn how to validate their sadness and express it. Women need to learn how to validate their anger and learn how to express it. And that's what I teach.
Excellent, excellent. And considering your specialty in kind of helping people emotionally with their anger, how do you guide them on how to express it?
Well, I don't do it directly because I don't have a private practice, but I do engage in websites like Quora, and I do podcasts. And what I do is I explain the emotion cycle. I explain what emotions are, why they have them. And what I want to do is I want to empower people. And information is power. The lack of information leaves people in the dark. And so they have to guess, or they have to make things up, or they have to rely on unreliable sources of information. So I'm providing access to information and educating. When you understand that your emotions are just tools, you don't have to avoid them. You have to learn how to use the tool. Again, the example would be the cell phone or the remote control or my computer. You push the wrong button, you don't have heat, you don't have access to audio. You push the right button, it works. And that's been a process for me because I'm old and I come from last century. So dealing with technologies, it's a learning process. And it's a learning process to deal with emotions. So when you explain what anger is and the message of anger, that you perceive a threat, when you look at anxiety, and anxiety is a future-based emotion, the message of which there may be a threat out there and the threat may hurt me. If you understand that, now if you're anxious, you can say, well, wait a minute, what's the message of anxiety? There may be a threat. How do I want to deal with that? Well, I teach in a university, and my students that often will say, the best way to deal with anxiety is to study and to prepare for that. So when you do that, you don't have to be worried about what may happen. You've now taken control of that. You've taken control of your life. If you take a look at sadness, the message of sadness is I've lost something. And the way to deal with that is to experience the loss and let yourself work through it. If you take a look at the emotion of guilt, the emotion of guilt says I've done something wrong. So if I've done something wrong, what do I need to do to correct it? And that's what I teach. Now, when you get into something like shame, if you have an abusive history, shame's a really insidious kind of emotion because it says it's not I've done something wrong. There's something wrong with me. I had to deal with a lot of shame with the young women. And the way you deal with shame is you say, look, I did the best that I could given my model of the world and my skill sets. So there's nothing wrong with me. I need to take a look at what I did. Now, that takes me to another rule that I developed, and that was, it was a basic relationship rule for understanding the behavior of others. Everybody in every situation, every important situation, does the best they can given two things. One is the model of the world, and two is their skill sets. Now, if you understand that, then if you're dealing with somebody who's coming at you sideways, for example, a toxic boss, you then, instead of blaming yourself, you can say, well, wait a minute. What is my boss's model of their interaction with me? What's their management style and so forth? What's their model and what are their skill sets? Maybe their model says, well, my best way to deal with employees is to put them down and make them feel bad. That's a lousy model, but if that's their model, you may not be able to change it. You may just have to change jobs. What about their skill sets? How good are they with people? So if you understand that the way to look at the behavior of another person is what's their model, or what's your model of the world, or my model of the world, how am I viewing other people? What's the lens through which I'm looking at my situation? And what are my skill sets? So if I'm not being effective with another person, am I not seeing them accurately, which is my model? Or do I just not know how to interact with them? Do I not know how to start a conversation? That's a skill set issue. And the way it works together, Jimbo, is this. Let's say I go into a social situation and I'm anxious or I'm nervous. All right. My anxiety tells me that I'm concerned about a future situation that may go sideways. So what do I need to do? I need to take a step back and take a look at the situation. So I look at the situation and I say, you know what? I'm out of my element here. I don't understand what's going on. So I may then have to take a step back, consult with somebody else or whatever I need to do to learn how to deal with people. So I use the emotion to tell me how I perceive the situation. I then use my basic relationship rule to tell me whether my model's off or I'm just lacking skills. And now I know where I need to go to do what I need to do to make me better at dealing with the situations in which I find myself. Does that make sense?
That makes complete sense. I now understand that you use emotions as a tool to improve your awareness.
Yes. And that's by the way what emotions are. Emotions are designed, if you will, by evolution to motivate us to take action quickly, and to inform us about how we perceive what's going on in our surroundings. That's what they do. They inform us of how we perceive our situation and then motivate us to take action to deal with that situation. Where mastery comes in is we take the next step, which is to evaluate or assess what we perceive and then choose how we want to respond. So we're no longer, if you will, at the mercy of our unconscious emotional reaction, because now we can decide consciously how we want to respond. The power of emotional mastery is we can now use the information our emotions provide us and then choose how we want to most effectively deal with the situation we're facing. So now that demystifies the whole idea of emotions. All emotions are adaptive, whether they feel good or not. The challenge is to be able to recognize what the emotion's telling you and then either keep your perception of what you see and take effective action, or change your perception, in which case the emotion changes and you're in a different situation. Emotions are very empowering when you understand them.
So the next step you mentioned, how do you think we could begin creating models in our head and seeing our own skill sets?
That's a really good question. And what that takes is the desire to master your emotions. And that's critical. And it's not easy, by the way. It is doable, but it's not easy. Once you decide, let's say that I have an issue with anger, or I have an issue with anxiety, or I have an issue with sadness, then the next step is to say, okay, I'm going to learn to master that. And then you're going to need to educate yourself. And that's where my blog comes in. You go to the blog, you pull down the index tab, and you look for the emotion of sadness. And you read and you educate yourself. Now, you can get my books, and I recommend it because I cover a lot of this in my books as well. But the best place to start probably is on the blog, because it's easy access and it's free and it's right there. Educate yourself about what sadness is, and then say, okay, how does this apply to me? Well, it applies to me in this way. I'm sad because I've lost something, or I'm anxious because there's an interview coming up. How do I deal with that? Well, again, I know that it's a future-based emotion. I need to prepare. Whatever the emotion happens to be, once you educate yourself, you now are empowered to begin to master that emotion. And again, it takes time. And what your viewers need to understand is when you start out learning to master emotions, you are developing a new habit. And it's not going to go well at first. Think about when you learned how to ride a bicycle. How many times did you fall off before you finally got it right? So it's not a quick process. It's a learning process. And you can also get feedback from other people. How do you deal with sadness? How do you deal with anger? And take all that in too. And then you can choose what you want to do. Now, here's a technique that I recommend to your viewers. In most cases, most of us are much better at giving advice to other people than we are at giving advice to ourselves. I used to tell my students that I was much better at dealing with their kids than I was with dealing with my own. The reason for that is because I have all this knowledge in my head, but when I deal with my own kids, I'm not dealing with them objectively. I'm dealing with them subjectively, and I got all these other emotions going on with my own kids. When I deal with your kids, I'm dealing with your kids objectively, and I can give you the benefit of my knowledge. So here's how you deal with that. What you do is you take out a pad of paper or on your computer, however you want to do it, and then you say to yourself, okay, you ask yourself the question that you're struggling with. What's the best way for me to deal with my anger? As if a friend of yours came to you and asked you that question. And then you write down all of the advice that you would give to your friend. And you need to write it down or type it in. And then what you do is you take that information that you wrote down or typed in and you put it away for a week or a couple of days. The time frame is irrelevant. And then you take it back out and then you read it and then follow your own advice. And what happens when you do that is you're now tapping into your ability to give good advice, and most of us have it. But you're doing it with yourself. You're now able to take your own advice and then you follow it. And that's often a good technique for tapping into what we know. And taking us, if you will, out of the picture. So if I'm giving you advice, I'm giving you the best advice I have, and I'm doing it objectively. So that's what I would suggest that your viewers do. They take a look at what their issues are. They attempt to educate themselves regarding the emotions. And then they give their advice to another person by writing it down or typing it in, and then follow their own advice. And sometimes they may need professional help because they just can't deal with the issues. And I highly recommend seeing somebody professionally if you have to. There are some very good counselors out there. It's not weakness. If I have a problem with my car, what do? I go to my mechanic. and he fixes it. If I have a problem with my psychological issues, I may have to go to a psychologist or a social worker and get help. Now, that's not always the case, but if it is, get the help that you need. The help is out there.
That's great. What are some of your best client success stories?
Well, I have to think back a bit. I did actually, I'm really happy with this. I did a podcast and I spoke about anger. And I had a therapist who listened to the podcast and had never really come across the idea of emotions as tools or dealing with anger or mastering anger. And she listened to the podcast, she bought my books, and then she started to use it with her clients. I felt really good about that. I also had actually he's a nephew 2 or 3 times removed, and he's had problems most of his life with drugs and alcohol and with anger. And he's taken anger management courses and they didn't help. Well, his aunt contacted me and said, "Can you help my son?" So I sent him my books and he read the books and he said, "That's the first time that I've really understood the whole idea what anger is and why I have it." And those books, my books, were very helpful in keeping him on track. He's now in a 12-step program and doing very well. He hasn't had an issue with his anger. So I'm really proud of that. I'm also happy I did a podcast dealing with policemen. This was years ago now. And I did some work with policemen when I was younger. And I developed the idea that policemen, when they go out on their shift, they put on their body armor and they put on their emotional armor. And they do that because they have to, because of the kind of things that they're coming in contact with. And as I explained when I was doing seminars, as I explained to these law officers, when they come home, they take off their body armor, but they forget to take off their emotional armor. So they walk into the house and their sons and daughters want attention from dad, and mom wants attention from dad, and they're just not ready for it. So I explained to them what you need to do is before you go home, you may need to drive around the neighborhood several times before you're ready to take off the emotional armor so you can walk in the house and now you can be you can be dad or you can be husband. And I did a podcast with somebody who his audience was law enforcement officers, and they had never thought about that concept before. So that was very educating for them as well. So those are the kinds of things that I look at and I'm really happy about. I also contribute to a site called Quora, and I've gotten feedback from folks on Quora.com who have said that the way I explain things is very easy to understand, and it helps them deal with emotions because now the emotions make sense to them. And that's the kind of thing that keeps me going in retirement, the ability to help people and to get feedback. Because the need is there. I mean, I can't reach everybody, but the more people I can reach, the better I feel. And the more accomplished I feel. That's what I want to do in retirement.
Excellent. And you also deal with incarcerated young women. Specializing in that, what have you learned?
Well, what I've learned there is again that women are kind of getting the short end of the stick when it comes to emotions, if you will. Women are socialized to be caretakers, and it's unfortunate. And that was especially the case with these young women who were incarcerated. I had, at one point in my caseload, I had 5 young women, all of whom had killed their children. And I was totally unprepared for that. And so were they. And it wasn't like they were monsters. It wasn't like they set out to kill their children. It happened. So what they did was monstrous, but they were not monsters. And what they taught me is I needed to come up with a way to help them get past the barriers that had enclosed them in terms of their own socialization while growing up. That they taught me, Jimbo, as much as I taught them. Because again, when I got out of graduate school, I did not have the skill sets for dealing with these kinds of issues. I had to learn on the job. But because of that learning, it got me to the point where I am now, if you will, where I teach people about emotions. I probably would not have gotten where I am. I wouldn't without going through the trial by fire with these young incarcerated women. And the staff, by the way, who had to deal with these women. They taught me as well. So if I hadn't gone through that, wouldn't have written my books and wouldn't be doing podcasts now. It all worked out.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to this, what I'm getting is you first go to the blogs, but more so on the books now.
Okay.
Are the books sort of the advanced level?
The books lay out the basics of the information, whether it's the emotions as tools or whether it's dealing with anger. There's some information in the books, like there are checklists for helping you become aware of your body and where you experience the emotions. So the books are the beginning. And I'd say basically the blog goes into much more detail. The books are fairly old now, but they're just as relevant today as they were when I wrote them. And people can access the information through the books, and that's great. Or they can access it through my blog. To be quite honest with you, I love selling books. I love people buying books, but the information on the blog is current, and there's much more information on the blog. So if people want to have the hardcover books in their hands, please go buy the book. The few cents that I make in terms of royalty is great. However you access the information is important to me. But if you want a place to start, go to the blog. It's free, and you can access as much information as is there. And again, the way the blog is set up, you go to the homepage, emotionsdoctor.com, go to the index, pull down the index tab, and then you can access all of the posts by title and by one-click access. It may take a little effort to go to the homepage and then pull down the index tab, but I can assure you the information that you'll gain access to is well worth it. And I'm adding to it. I post twice a month, and I come up with new stuff as well. So the books are good. And if you want a hardcover book, go to Amazon.com and buy the books. If you want to access the information right away, go to the blog.
So when it comes to emotions, what is the first emotion a person should begin tackling?
Depends on the individual. Probably the one that most people are going to want to know more about is anger, because it's the most misunderstood emotion that's out there. And we all experience it. And we're not trained to deal with it, men or women. So my guess is that probably the most misunderstood will be anger. But people are dealing with sadness, and they're dealing with anxiety. If you take a look at my students, they're dealing with anxiety. And for them, it won't be anger. For them, the most misunderstood emotion will be anxiety or anxiousness. And that probably in today's world with COVID and all that kind of stuff, that's the one that people are probably dealing with now, which would be anxiety. Now, the interesting thing about anxiety, by the way, if you're preparing for an upcoming exam or you're preparing for an upcoming interview, and you're anxious about it. There's a flip side of anxiety, and that's called anticipation. Anticipation is a future-based emotion, the message of which is there's a upcoming event and I'm looking forward to it. So the way you turn anxiety into anticipation is by preparation. If I have an upcoming interview and I prepare for it and I do the best that I can, now I'm ready. Now I'm saying, bring it on. And that's anticipation. What the problem with anxiety is, what most people do is they use they experience their anxiety as what's called distress, DISSTRESS. And anxiety as distress will keep people doing nothing. I'm concerned about what's up ahead. I'm not prepared for it. It's going to go bad. That's called catastrophizing, by the way. And so I'm just going to do nothing. I'm going to sit here. Anxiety as eustress, EUSTRESS, says there's a situation coming up. It could go bad, but I'm going to prepare for it. That's anxiety as eustress. That is strategically mastering anxiety. And that's what I teach my students. If you're anxious about a test, that's great. Use that anxiety to motivate you to study and find out what you need to know. So now you anticipate the exam and you do well.
Okay. And then the next one maybe is when we're dealing with all these different emotions at the heat of time in this day and age. We've discussed anger and anxiety, but what about sadness? How do we deal with that?
Sadness. The message of sadness is, I have lost something important. What sadness does is it motivates us to take a step back and grieve the loss of whatever we've lost. That's what sadness does. That's what it's designed to do. When we get sad, we slow down. We don't want to engage. We want to disengage. And that's what we need to do. So if you're sad, then you need to ask yourself, what have I lost? Because one of two things can happen. Maybe there is a significant loss, or maybe there isn't. That's where mastering sadness comes in. So let's say that I'm dating in me in my younger years, and my girlfriend, because I've been married now 50 years, my girlfriend leaves me and I'm sad. So I have to ask myself, what have I really lost? What have I lost? Well, yeah, I lost my girlfriend. But is that the end of the world? No. So I'm going to take a step back. I'm going to say, you know what? I really wish that she hadn't left me, but she did. And now I'm sorry that happened, but now I need to move on. But if I've lost a parent, I'm going to need to take some time. Or in my case, if I lose a spouse, I'm going to need to take some time to step back, to regroup, and to deal with that. So that's a very good question, but let me give you another technique here for dealing with things like sadness or regret. If I've known people who will be sad and will be mourning for years. Now, it used to be that the period of mourning was a matter of months, and now it seems to be going on longer and longer. But if your sadness is getting you down and you can't function, then what you want to do is you want to use what's called an IWNBI. IWNBI stands for it would be nice if. This is an antidote to regret as well, Jimbo. So if I'm sad and I can't get past it, then I'm going to need to say to myself, it would be nice if I hadn't lost my spouse, but I did. And now I need to then start living again. What an IWNBI does is it enables you to acknowledge that the loss, to acknowledge it, and then to move past it. It's the same way with regret. When we have regrets, regrets will psychologically kill you. And the reason for that is that if I regret I didn't do such and such, you can't change it. And regret won't go away. It'll gnaw at you and eat you up and chew you up. The antidote to regrets isn't a Whitney. It would be nice if I hadn't done such and such, but I did. And now I need to move on and grow. And that enables you to acknowledge that you screwed up, to acknowledge it, and then to say, okay, I'm going to learn from it and I'm going to get back to living. So sadness is a good one. You need to acknowledge sadness and take the time to mourn, acknowledge the loss, and then grow past it. Otherwise, you get stuck in sadness and you never progress. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Now, the one emotion that I don't think we've discussed yet, which I think is quite interesting, is happiness.
Happiness, yes. Happiness is considered to be what's called a positive emotion. Now, I need to say there are no good or bad emotions. They're all adaptive. But there are so-called positive emotions and so-called negative emotions. And the idea here is positive emotions feel good. Negative emotions feel bad. That's called the hedonic quality of the emotion. So let's take happiness. The message of happiness is there is an event that I'm facing that is pleasing to me and that I want to engage with more. Happiness motivates us to stay involved. Love is another one, which is a so-called positive emotion because it feels good. Barbara Fredrickson did a whole lot of work on so-called positive emotions like happiness. And again, they motivate us to stay engaged. Those are the feel-good emotions. So if you're feeling happy, great, engage in whatever you're being happy with. But the emotion is still functioning as a tool. Now, when you think of happiness, I don't have to assess happiness and I don't have to validate it. I'm just going to go with it. But it's functioning the same way as anger. Anger tells us how we perceive our environment and we need to make a decision. Happiness tells us how we perceive our environment and we just decide to stay engaged. So happiness is a good one.
Do you think certain emotions can be connected, or it may be easier to go from one emotion to another?
I think that happens. It happens automatically. Like with men, and we were talking about earlier, we tend to slip through emotions fairly easily. Let's say we start out with we're angry and we do something stupid when we're angry. And we want to blame what we do on somebody else instead of taking responsibility for ourselves. So we get angry and we do something stupid. And then we feel guilty about being angry and doing something stupid. So we feel guilty. We've done something wrong. And then we feel ashamed because we're feeling guilty and we did something stupid. And so we don't want to deal with guilt. We don't want to deal with shame. So we cover it over with anger. So those are now secondary emotions. Secondary emotions are the emotions that we feel after we feel the first one, which is the primary emotion. So it's something that you need to be aware of, and you can slip through these emotions fairly easily. It isn't that one emotion necessarily leads to another. You feel the primary emotion, and then you think about the emotion that you felt, and you generate a secondary emotion about the first emotion. So it feels like we're slipping from one emotion to another. It's just that we're evaluating it differently, which generates the emotion. Because remember now, Jimbo, that the emotion follows how we perceive our environment. If we change our perception, the emotion changes. So, let's say, and I'm just making this up, but we're happy about being engaged in our hobby. And we're engaged in our hobby and we're just doing that. We're doing that. And we don't take care of business. We forget that we have a report that's due. So now we're going from, geez, I'm really happy with being engaged in my hobby, but I forgot to do the report. Now I feel really dumb. So it's a different perception, different emotion. And again, in each case, if you're going to master the emotion, you need to say, what's the emotion? What's it telling me about how I perceive my environment? And how valid is that emotion? So if I'm happy and I'm engaged in, and it may seem kind of a silly example, but I'm engaged in my hobby and I forgot to do the report or I forgot to send a particular email. Okay, I simply forgot to do it. No, I'm not dumb. It would be nice if I had gotten that report out, but I didn't. So now what I need to do is I need to put the hobby aside and I need to focus on the report. Or I need to send an email saying, I'm really sorry I wasn't there, or whatever it happens to be. So again, each emotion needs to be assessed and validated, and then a decision needs to be made what you're going to do about the situation your emotion is informing you that you're facing. That's how it all fits together. Because I mean, again, remember the basic relationship rule. I'm always doing the best that I can given my model of the world and my skill sets. Well, if my model of the world is the only thing that's important to me right now is my hobby, I need to change that model because it's led to a result I don't want. It's not a matter of not having skills. I need to change my model of the world. And my model of the world now is I need to put the hobby aside and move on to other things.
So when it comes to a day-to-day life, how do you sort of work through your emotions?
That's a good question. And I mean, I'll give you an example. Yesterday, my grandkids are now with me for a while, with me and my wife for another couple of days. My son is moving to a new job, so we have my daughter-in-law, my grandkids are here, and the dogs are barking, and the baby's crying, and the 1-year-old is upset about something, and I'm getting angry. Now, I had to take a step back and say, wait a minute, what's going on here? Is there a threat? No, there's no threat. The baby's crying because he's hungry. The 1-year-old's upset because of whatever he was upset about, and the dogs are barking outside. There was no threat. My anger was, while it's what I felt, it was invalid. It was not appropriate to that situation. So I took a step back, took a deep breath, and said, what's going on here? Well, what was going on is I was thinking about things that I had to do, and I was feeling overwhelmed. So I had to leave the situation. So I left the situation for an hour, and then I came back and everything was fine. But what I could have done, and I'm glad I didn't, is I could have said, you know what? I'm angry. There's a threat. My grandsons are disrupting my environment. The dogs are barking. I could have yelled at the grandkids and yelled at the dogs. Would have been totally inappropriate. So I have to do the same thing that I'm recommending to your listeners. I have to be aware of my own emotions. I have to experience the emotion. Then I have to take a step back and a deep breath, and I have to assess the nature of the emotion. And then I have to take action. And that's what I did. Now, do I always do that? No. Sometimes I get angry and I snap at my wife. I wish that I could say I was perfect. Far from it.
No one's
I'm
perfect.
still dealing with the same issues I'm teaching other people to deal with. I'm just better at it because I've done it longer. But I'm still doing the same thing. I just don't do it as often.
And that's a great take right there on, being realistic and doing this properly. So when it comes to the website, let's bring up the website quickly and let's kind of run through a way to kind of navigate the blog.
Good idea. Can we do that, or you want me to do it? Oh, you're doing it. Good. Okay, perfect. Now, if you take a look where it says, I don't know if you can see my pointer. Maybe you're not sharing my screen, but right up there where it says index, click on index. Yeah, good. Now you see it says anger. Yeah. Okay. So what you've done now, those are the categories. So if you want to learn about anger, you click on anger. Scroll up. Those are all my posts on anger. That's perfect. So now you can pick one and click on that, and that'll take you right to the post. Perfect. And then scroll up. There you are.
Excellent. Okay.
And
What do you think is the first post for anger you think someone should look at?
You know, that's a very good question in terms of which post. You know, I think the one at the top, the message of anger, it is more than just a perception of threat.
Okay.
Because then that explains what anger is and why they have it and how the whole process works. So it does take a little bit of effort and a couple of clicks. And I suppose, you know, if I were a good web designer, I would design it more to be more effective, or excuse me, more efficient and easier. But that's the best I've been able to come up with. It's all there, and that's the way to access it. And if they want to know about the emotional process, they can just go to emotions as tools. That's a category as well, and then I'll talk about the emotional process. There it is, mastering emotions as tools. Those are all the general articles. The emotions as tools model, I would just start there.
Great. And this is basically everything we sort of discussed.
Yes, it is. It's all there.
Great. Excellent. All right.
So that's what I suggest that your viewers do, that they go to the website and just explore it. Just take a look and see what article catches their fancy, and that's the best way to start.
Great, great.
And then they can educate themselves.
There's the website.
Excellent.
So kind of the next thing I would like to go to is, here's a question I have for you. If you could go back in time and give yourself a little bit of advice, what type of advice would you give that young man?
That's an interesting question. And I like the way you phrased it. I was asked on a podcast a couple of days ago, if I could go back and change anything, what would I change? And my answer to that was I wouldn't change anything. And the reason why I wouldn't change anything is because I like where I ended up. And if I were to change something, I might not end up where I am. But to give advice, if I could go back and give advice to myself as a kid, because in my family, emotions were not dealt with well at all, I would give my young self the advice that it's okay to feel whatever it is that you feel. It's okay to feel, and let the feelings happen and work through them instead of trying to fight them or avoid them. That's the advice I would give myself back then, so that I wouldn't get hung up on emotions and I wouldn't feel like I had to avoid them. Because for me, I went into my head, and It's okay. It worked out, but it could have gone sideways as well. Fortunately, it didn't.
It worked out.
It worked out. I'm very fortunate the way things happen. Doors opened for me, and I walked through them to get me where I am. But that's the advice I would give my young self. It's okay to feel. There's nothing wrong with you. They're just feelings. Take a look at the feelings, take a look at your situation, and make the best decision possible.
Great. And additionally, are there any final words you'd like to give to the audience right now?
Yeah, I would really encourage your audience to give themselves permission to feel, not act on your feelings necessarily, but to feel. And once you give yourself permission to feel, now you're in a position to then explore those feelings and learn about them. You don't have to avoid the feelings. The information is out there. In most cases, again, in most cases, the information that I made available to you will allow you to educate yourself and get through the vast majority of situations that you're facing. For most people, professional help won't be needed. For some, it will. And for those folks, professional help is available. But give yourself permission to feel. Educate yourself as to what those feelings are and why you have them and how to master them strategically. And then you will be in a position to use those feelings and move past them. That's the advice that I would give. The information's out there. It's available. It's free. Take advantage of it. That's why I maintain the blog. And if you want to buy the books, that's great too. But most of the information is on the blog, to be quite honest. I mean, I come on the blog. I was on a blog a while back, and somebody said, Dr. Daube, you wrote 2 books too. Yes, I did. But the reason why I do these, again, is to educate people. And many folks won't go to Amazon and buy it, and that's fine. Get it on the blog. It doesn't matter. It's not critical to me. What's important to me is that you get the information and educate yourself. Do that, please. Instead of letting your emotions take advantage of you and you make dumb decisions you later regret. Get the information. It's there. Educate yourself and master your emotions as strategic tools.
Excellent, excellent. All right. Thank you again, Dr. Daube. It's been a privilege.
Thank you for having me, Jimbo. I really appreciate it. It's been fun. All the best.
Excellent. So we have a few shout outs here. I would first like to give a shout out to Dark Joseph Ravine. He's an important person, especially to the business. He's from Canada, and he kind of helps to build people's businesses as a marketing agent. And he also works hard to empower other people's lives and take them out of the dark ravines, as his name goes. And again, gratitude, gratefulness. You need to appreciate what you have. He has definitely helped to push our show out there. Even though he's not a sponsor of our show, he's definitely helped to push our content out there and really give us the platform that we need. And then the next person is a special thanks to another sponsor, the Six Figures University, helping people to grow financially, to grow spiritually, and to also conquer the goals that they have in life. And again, if you want to learn the secrets to opening a salon, the secrets to improving in real estate, go to them. They know what to do. And then the final person, Judy Ryan, our LifeWork Systems affiliate and collaborative partner. Great woman again. She goes out of her way to help improve businesses, to improve the business infrastructure. And if you want to improve your business as well and your employee infrastructure, speak to this woman. And again, we have a new website today. It's amazing, and it's basically the Jimbo Parish Show, and we're a full-on Roku channel now. All our Roku episodes are online. This one's going to be online as well on the Roku channel as well. And yeah, check us out on Roku too. Okay. Great talk. So, all right, I am Jimbo Paris. This is the Jimbo Paris Show. Thank you again, Dr. Daube. And this is the show. Thank you for listening to the Jimbo Paris Show.